Thank you very much. It's nice to see a group like this size out for something like this. When Carol says I've been retired for 10 years, it doesn't seem that way, but then again, time seems to speed up as we get older. Wrestling is something that nobody ever wants to admit they know anything about. But you'd be surprised how much everyone seems to know about it and all the names that were involved, especially when you go a little further back. For me, it's been a fantastic lifelong story, mainly because of all the fantastic people I've met over the years, and I guess I can say the characters I've met over the years. Paul the Butcher Vachon has written a series of books entitled When Wrestling Was Real. And it used to be a time when we could suspend disbelief and really get involved in what we were seeing. When I was growing up in southern Manitoba, wrestling was an annual event at the local agricultural fair, and I watched that for the first time, and I was bitten by the bug immediately. Some of you will remember in the 1950s, about the mid-50s, when television first came on the scene, and it was Saturday night at 9 o'clock on TV from Maple Leaf Gardens was wrestling, and we used to stand on the street in our hometown peering through the window of the local radio and TV shop where he had a TV set up, and those were the days of Whipper Watson, Pat Flanagan, and many others, and I'm sure some people here will remember those names. Wrestling has always been, I guess, a storytelling, and it had a very much of an ethnic flavor in the 1950s and 60s, and that was based on rivalries from the Second World War. I think you all remember the nasty Germans and the sneaky Japanese, all the real bad guys that were around. And of course, there was the Kalmykov brothers from Russia. They're actually from Saskatchewan. Ivan Koloff is another one. He was originally from Ontario. He wrestled in this area under a different name, but his family still lives in Chilliwack. So, you know, when you see these names and they've risen right to the top of their field, and you realize how close to home they are. Most of the Japanese wrestlers were actually Hawaiian. Mitsu Arakawa and Kenji Shibuya. Kenji was born in Utah and raised in California, and he didn't speak Japanese, so he just mumbled when he got on TV. I think some of you will remember Harold Sakata. He was the man named Oddjob in the James Bond films, the one with the buzzsaw hat. I met him later after he retired, and he went back home to Hawaii. Spent quite a few hours with him. It was a lot of fun talking about it. And another one of the great Japanese wrestlers was Tor Kamada. And when his career was over, he retired and ran a restaurant in Saskatoon. Mitsu Arakawa, whom I mentioned before, and Tor Kamada were a tag team known as Mr. Hito and Mr. Moto. And then we also had the nasty Germans. I think a lot of people will remember Hans Schmidt, who was the greatest one of the Germans ever to wrestle in North America. His real name was Guy LaRose from Quebec. Von Steiger brothers, Kurt and Carl. Carl was a native of Winnipeg. Name was Lorne Corlett, and I don't know what nationality that was, but he did the same thing when he had to talk German. He just mumbled a lot. One of the biggest names, and this is in southern states, especially in Texas, was Waldo von Erich. And I think he actually was a German. And then we also had Fritz von Erich, who was very big in Texas. So those are some of the names that I've run into. But after high school, I worked in Winnipeg, as Carol said, at the Free Press. I was then an office boy, and we were given the chance to do some reporting in the evenings on our own time, and there was no extra pay. This is how you moved up the steps to become a reporter. But I noticed later that all the boys and the women who made the effort and worked these extra hours without pay actually did become journalists, and those who didn't got rich. I started doing photography of the matches and then promo pictures of the wrestlers, and I still see some of them today from many, many years ago that appear in magazines and books. But I always wanted to get into the ring myself, and of course when you're 125 pounds at the time, and I said at the time, I finally decided to pursue refereeing. I lived in North Battleford, and the weekly wrestling matches were in Saskatoon, so I drove up there every week just to get a chance to referee. And later I moved to Calgary, and I stayed with the wrestling while working at the Calgary Herald. I did the entire Stampede wrestling scene. I'm sure you'll all remember the name Stu Hart and his family, and their famous house up on the hill, and they had a training facility in their basement. And they used to go to all the small towns on Saturday nights, and I went with Stu to set up the ring and tear it down. And there were many big names that Stu brought into the business. One example of that I can think of is superstar Billy Graham. Stu used to hang around the Stampeders training camp looking for big bodies, and one of those, even in the early days, he found Gene Kaniski with the Edmonton Eskimos after he played there. So that's where some of them came from, and there's quite a few others who started out in the Canadian Football League and were picked up by Stu Hart and then trained to be wrestlers. When I moved to Abbotsford, there was not much in the way of wrestling action, although I did spend some time with the wrestlers who were stationed in this area. And strangely enough, that's when wrestling was fairly big right here in Nanaimo. They had the matches at the old Civic Arena, and still hear stories from them with local people getting involved in fights. I returned to Saskatoon and picked up where I left off. I refereed every week. Stampede Wrestling had a circuit at that time, and this used to be in all the wrestling areas. They called them territories. And Tuesday was Edmonton, Wednesday Saskatoon, Thursday Regina, and Friday in Calgary. So I made the complete loop around. That's close to 1,500 miles every week that these guys traveled, and many of them in winter blizzards. I remember one that happened. I was in Calgary at the time. I wasn't on the tour, and they had brought in Jersey Joe Walcott, the old boxer, to be a referee, and they moved it from the Victoria Pavilion to the Stampede Corral because it would be that big a crowd. And you guessed it, it was a very, very big crowd. I think the Stampede Corral was full, and the wrestlers were on the road between Regina and Calgary. And we didn't know what to do, and Stu was on the road with them, so I had Stu's wife and myself looked at the 9 or 10,000 people in the stands who'd all paid to be there. And we had a couple of local boys who wrestled once in a while, and we decided let's get the show on the road because people were getting a little upset that there was no action coming. So we got a couple of the guys in the ring. I refereed, and it was one of the longest matches I think they've ever had. And slowly, 2 by 2 and 3 by 4, the wrestlers started coming in. They had, and there were no cell phones then, so you couldn't tell where they were or how far down the road they were. But it was a terrible blizzard, but they all made it, and they had a full show, and it went off as a full success. I finally moved back to Winnipeg in 1971 and then refereed there until 1978 when the promoter quit and went elsewhere, so I got the job to be the promoter of the wrestling in Winnipeg. And these are all operated out of Minneapolis, where the head office was, and they run the same as the territory: Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Denver, and places like that. So, and in those days, it was not uncommon to get 10,000 people into the Winnipeg arena for the wrestling. So I really enjoyed that part of it. But at the same time in Winnipeg, we had the small promotion where we'd go to the small towns, Carmen, Portage la Prairie, Brandon, Steinbach, and that was promoted by Al Tomko. And Al also had a TV studio in Winnipeg that he set up. It was small, it was rinky-dink, but he'd do the wrestling interviews for the TV show in Brandon. And I was lucky enough to get appointed to do the interviews with the wrestlers because I knew the business. And I had one wrestler there who I thought didn't have a chance to ever make it in this business because he was maybe 135 pounds soaking wet. But when I stuck a microphone in front of his face, he was magic. He could judge a crowd. He knew what would get them heated up, and he crossed all the lines there were. His name was Roddy Piper. I'm sure you've heard of him. That's his book that just came out. I'll talk about it a little more later. And he could judge the crowd so well that the interviews really are designed to sell tickets for the next show, get people interested in coming to the next show. And when he went from the Winnipeg area, he hit it very well in Los Angeles, where when he first arrived, there were a lot of Hispanics or Mexicans in the wrestling in Los Angeles. And his very first night there, he took after the father of our wrestling family and created a stir. And for about 4 years, they sold out the building every night. And he had the whole family he was wrestling against. But that's just the way he was. He could gauge what would get people excited. He died last year at the age of 50, far too young. But and he was originally from Winnipeg. Well, he was born in Saskatoon, but grew up in Winnipeg. He used to come to my house quite often when he was first starting the training. So that book, by the way, is available in bookstores right now. And I'm pushing it because I was surprised when I got it how generous he and his family were in mentioning me and giving me credit in the book. So that was quite an honor. During the time in Winnipeg, I was also a special referee. They called it a troubleshooter referee, and I was sent to do matches in Toronto, Minneapolis, Denver, Chicago, St. Paul, and other areas. And I had a full-time job at the Winnipeg Tribune at the time, but I remember one where I worked my shift at the Tribune till early afternoon, rushed to the airport, flew to Denver, got there in time to referee the matches, and there used to be a midnight flight from Denver back to Winnipeg, and I was back at my desk in the morning after having worked the previous day and then the next morning again. Others that stand out, Minneapolis used to have a very, very big Thanksgiving Day show in the States, and as you know, the American one is in the last weekend in November. So I would always make sure that I got the job of refereeing there at the time, because I took my wife along, and that was just a perfect time to do Christmas shopping. And that's when they had all the bargains right after Thanksgiving. But I remember one of the Thanksgiving trips we did in the match. One of the wrestlers somehow hit me over the head with a chair during the match. And after the match and the arena had emptied out, he came over to where my wife and 8-year-old daughter were standing and asked if he could have a ride back to the hotel. That wasn't the stunning part. When my sweet, innocent little girl shouted, "No, you bastard, you hit my dad." We never did think that would come out of her mouth, I think. But as I said earlier, the best thing was all the people I met. I recently made a list of the wrestlers I actually was in the ring with, and I know there are many I've forgotten, but I got to meet, I mentioned Jersey Joe Walcott earlier, also Rocky Marciano was another of the people I met, and I think those are familiar names to sports fans from over the years. People have their own opinion about wrestling, and as I said, it was a totally different era. It's, as Vachon said, it's when wrestling was real, not what you see on TV nowadays, which is a soap opera. But each year, there's a reunion of the wrestling fraternity in Las Vegas, and it attracts about 500 wrestlers from all the over the years and all the various territories. And what astounded me the last time I was there, the number of wrestlers who are using canes or walkers or even show up in wheelchairs. As we said, it's showbiz, but when somebody picks you up 6 feet in the air and slams you on the mat, that mat isn't very thick. Somewhere down the line and over the years, it adds up, and you're going to get to pay for it in your later life. I've been asked to come next May to that reunion and give a seminar on refereeing, and that's at Las Vegas. It's called the Cauliflower Alley Club, and I'm really looking forward to that. Wrestling has made a comeback in Nanaimo to some extent. There's a couple of local fellows who have started Vancouver Island Professional Wrestling, and they have about one show per month. It's at the Departure Bay Activity Center, and if you're interested in wrestling and like to see what they do, you can find out the dates and attend them. But I'm not going to go through the list of all the wrestlers I had here, but I'll just jump at a few. Andre the Giant, of course, everybody heard of. Angelo Mosca was a football player for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. I got to know him very well. He used to wrestle in that Saskatoon circuit, and he was a bad guy. And I know one night a fan threw a football in the ring, and to get rid of it, Angelo threw it at a cop for him to keep. But Angelo threw like a football player. And he was banned from wrestling in Saskatoon for a year because the chief of police was the commissioner of wrestling, and he had absolutely no understanding whatsoever. Let's see. Bob Sweetan, I don't know if many people have heard of him. He used to wrestle at Saskatoon Circuit or Calgary. And I was surprised. I got a phone call from him one day. He had moved to Nanaimo after his retirement. His relatives are all still here, but as by now you've guessed, his name wasn't really Sweetan. So, but there was a family in New Brunswick. The Cormier family had 4 of their boys went into wrestling. The Beast and Leo Burke and Rudy Kay. And Dan Prophet was a fairly well-known wrestler in that Calgary circuit. He's originally from Duncan. And Rocky Johnson, the original, he was from Halifax. He's a Canadian, and he went and wrestled in Hawaii and married Ata Maivia, the daughter of Peter Maivia, who was a wrestler, and their son is Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. But so he's half Canadian and half Hawaiian. It doesn't say that very often. But Roddy Piper, reading in the book, I've discovered he has relatives in Nanaimo. I haven't traced them down yet, but I'm going to try. So. Okay, thank you.